Hey guys, so I come to you with a little discussion video today. This is a video that I have been meaning to make for quite some time, but just haven't really gotten my thoughts together and notes together and turned on the camera, so I thought that I would finally do that. So, what I want to talk about today is nonfiction, and my experience reading nonfiction, why I like it, why I think people are still kind of intimidated by it, and perhaps how to solve those problems, or at least my thoughts on solving those problems, and also just a little bit comparing reading nonfiction to fiction. For me, my interest in reading in general was really tied up in my interest in nonfiction. Some of the earliest books that I was really into were nonfiction books. Really, I think what drew me to reading was learning about philosophy. Like two of the earliest books that I remember loving and that I still love are the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius and Thus Spoke Zarathustra by Friedrich Nietzsche. And for me, it was really reading, the attraction of the reading life was sort of learning and mind expansion. And when those are your motives, and great characters and gripping plots and luminous prose aren't, then nonfiction is kind of a natural way to go. And that's not to say that you won't find great characters, gripping plots, and luminous prose in nonfiction. I mean, the portraits some memoirists paint of themselves are certainly just as, if not more, fascinating than a lot of the portraits that novelists paint of made-up characters in their books. If we're talking about prose style, a writer like Ralph Waldo Emerson, I would pit his prose against any fiction writer from any age. But I think that we do tend to come to nonfiction, initially at least, to learn about a subject. And the idea of learning has with it a lot of unfortunate associative links, I think. We think of learning, and then we think of school, and then we think of drudge work, and then we think of just generally not having fun. Whereas when we think of fiction, we think of reading for pleasure, reading to sort of learn about ourselves in the world in a sort of more existential sense, which just sort of feels a bit more immediate and easier to swallow than learning about the Roman Empire or something. And so there's that unfortunate associative link of nonfiction with drudge work. And the other big problem I think people run into with nonfiction is that they will come into a new subject and pick a book that is just not really a beginner level book. It's just going to be a bit too much, because if you were to start your adventure into learning about the Roman Empire with The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire by Edward Gibbon, you would just be overwhelmed by the amount of information on every single page. You would be being introduced to new places and new people and new events that you had never heard of before, and just every page would take so much effort. And on top of that, it would be, 5 volumes long, and it would just be incredibly difficult. And I think that is another obstacle to getting into nonfiction, is where to start with a subject, because you can't start with something huge like that. You need a priming in a subject before you can start to really delve into the big works, I think. And we live in an age where that sort of thing is really easy to come by. Every year there are published many volumes that are just, a very brief introduction to philosophy, or fascism, or communism, or something. And for example, earlier this year I read Vivian Schweitzer's book A Mad Love, which is an introduction, a book that's supposed to introduce you to opera if you have no previous experience with it. And it's barely 200 pages. It just goes through the general history of opera, the general concepts in opera. And once you read a book like that, you will have a good grounding in the subject to read more substantial works, and to not be faced with new information and concepts on every page. You will still be learning new stuff, but you will know enough about the subject already so that it'll just be easier for you to process all the new information and ideas that might be being presented to you in a more substantial book. In terms of the other issue of associating learning with drudge work, well, I think I have two thoughts on that subject. the first is, I think what's crucial is just finding a subject that you are just, head over heels in love with, that you just, it doesn't matter how big the book is, you just want to learn about the subject anyway. It doesn't matter if the book is 1,000 pages long or is 3 volumes long or whatever. You just want to learn about it. And, you can just look to any documentary you've watched or any YouTube video you've watched. I'll bet a lot of people who watch BookTube have watched YouTube videos on other subjects, whether it be history or philosophy or sociology or psychology. You've probably watched other YouTube videos on those subjects, and those are, for one thing, those act as those primers that I was mentioning, but also those are subjects that you probably are super interested in and that you would probably enjoy reading books about. And the other sort of solution to that problem is that I think once you do have that grounding, once you, know the subject relatively well, I think reading more about that subject becomes exponentially more fun. Both because you're learning about a subject that you like, sure, but also just, I think it's a lot of fun to live inside of a world that you know really well. Like subjects that I'm interested in, like religion and evolution and psychology. I love reading books on those subjects, not just because I'm learning new things, but also because I just like being around the ideas and like hearing those ideas articulated in new and different ways and being made to think about them in different ways. That is just really fun and exciting, and it's why it's easy for me personally to pick up a 500, 1,000 page book on religion or on psychology. So yeah, those are some solutions to some of the problems with nonfiction that I think people have that I would like to propose. And now I want to just touch briefly on comparing fiction to nonfiction. I think another advantage that nonfiction has over fiction is that I actually think nonfiction is easier to write. I think that, barring the amount of research that goes into nonfiction, I do think that on average, nonfiction books, it takes a lot more scholarship to write them, even though I know a lot of novelists, especially historical novelists, do a lot of research to write their books. With nonfiction, you literally cannot write a book if you don't do research, whereas you can actually write a novel if you don't do any research. Barring that side of the equation, just the writing of the book, I think is easier in nonfiction than fiction. It's easier to write a good nonfiction book than a good novel or a short story. Because in fiction, you're working from the ground up. You're starting with, you're creating a work of art ex nihilo, essentially. And you have to make people care about these characters. You have to create characters. You have to create a setting and a plot and everything. And you have to make it convincing and interesting. Whereas with a book on history, for example, you already have a plot and characters and setting all made for you already. You just have to go find the information and then write it up in such a way that people will find it interesting and pleasurable to read. So I just think that there's possibly less of a variability in the quality of nonfiction books than fiction books, because bad novels are, horrendous. But even in a bad or mediocre nonfiction book, you'll still probably learn something. I find it difficult to even get rid of nonfiction books, whereas I get rid of novels all the time. Just because even in bad nonfiction books, I often do find that there is something I learned from them, and I find that valuable, and think I might reference it at some point, and so I have a hard time getting rid of nonfiction books for that reason. So anyway, those are just some thoughts on fiction and nonfiction. I would love to hear any responses, whether people agree or disagree. Let me know in the comments anything I left out or didn't say, or anything you have to add. I'm just interested to hear. So anyway, yeah, that is really all. I hope you found this interesting. I hope you're all having a nice day, and I will talk to you all later. Bye, guys.